All right, so let's talk about some social dimensions of sustainability. And in this presentation, I tend to use social and cultural kind of interchangeably. I always think of it as sociocultural factors. And the way that this presentation is set up is that I basically give examples from my own life where I have come across examples where the social elements of things have really driven solutions or driven what's going on in a specific scenario. So what I'm going to do is just kind of talk you through some examples to get you thinking about this in a little bit more depth. How do we actually design with social sustainability in mind? And the first thing that I like to talk about is this is my list of kind of non-technical factors that go into design. So when I think about technical factors for design, I think about material choice and size and all my engineering calcs, right? But when I think about non-technical factors, I think about things like sustainability, but I also think about things like robustness and reliability and longevity and acceptability and long-term cost and unintended consequences, and what I call socio-cultural appropriateness. And basically what I mean by that last one is whether or not the solution is actually really good for the people that it's meant to serve. And I think this is something that I've come across so many times in my life where it is not socio-culturally appropriate. So I like to kind of talk about that topic specifically, like what does it actually mean for the solution to be appropriate for people? And I think that that's really critical, designing with people in mind. So I like to just give you a little geography of where things are. This first example is going to be from Nova Scotia, Canada, and this is a community that I had the privilege of working with while I was up there studying for my PhD. So the first example is about First Nations drinking water design. So First Nations are very similar to Native American communities in the United States, where they are federally regulated, but they're not provincially regulated. So there's kind of some issues and concerns there. And this photo shows the community that I'm talking about. This is the community of Politec, and it basically is on it's on a lake up in Cape Breton, Lake Bras d'Or. And there's a strait basically that separates parts of the community, and you can kind of see that you've got a dirt road and that it's a small kind of isolated community. And there's kind of this progression of how there were drinking water failures basically in these communities. And I want to kind of step you through what happened as a way to kind of show you how something that was technically appropriate for these types of systems ended up not being socioculturally appropriate in these systems, and how it has this legacy of being unsustainable. So something that I like to do as a researcher, and it's a little bit unique as an engineer, is I actually have what's called a positionality statement. So this is something that we do in the research world. And what it does is it contextualizes my experiences, especially when I am working with people who are not similar to me. So when I write papers, and I worked with First Nations communities, I actually used to include this in my papers, which is not common in engineering, but it is very common in ethnography studies, anthropology. It's very common there. So what it does is it basically acknowledges the fact that I bring a Western white American woman's perspective to the type of research that I'm doing. So I kind of make sure that I present anything that I present about First Nations with this understanding that I'm a partner to them, and that people have given me their time and trusted me to present this information accurately. So this is something that I like to bring up whenever we talk about social, cultural kind of things, because your own personal perspective has a big influence on how you think about design. And I think the first thing to really thinking about how your perspective impacts design is to think about a positionality statement. So we can talk about this in the course if we want to, in our discussion about what it would actually take to write a positionality statement, and I'm happy to discuss that with you. But let's talk about kind of design. So we're going to start in the 1980s. And so we first have this first water treatment plant being installed in the 1980s in this community. This was prime time to be installing a lot of these systems. And you can kind of see the area where they're installing the water treatment plants in a circle in red. It's on this very muddy bank on this, this little peninsula here. And basically what they did is they selected what's called a membrane filtration facility. It's a more advanced technology, it removes a lot of solids, it removes a lot of things that you would expect to kind of be in this very silty surface water here. But they only selected that based on 2 water quality samples. And I don't know how much you know about designing water treatment at this point, but 2 water quality samples is not enough to do design. They had 2 samples from 1975, and they said, well, based on that, we're going to design for this. And those samples were from the same season. They weren't from different times of the year. So we're starting off with not enough data, which is kind of a problem. And then we have to put an intake into this lake in order to use this surface water. But there was a lot of debate about putting that intake in because this was actually an area for traditional local fishing. And so people didn't want an intake in this area because this was very traditional place where people would go to fish. It has a lot of community importance. And then the plant that was installed, the water treatment plant, was going to use chlorine chemicals, and that was something that people really didn't want. We talked, I think, briefly about how adding chemicals in a First Nations kind of perspective, in a cultural perspective, is not considered appropriate because you don't add chemicals to Mother Nature. And so there's kind of these competing things going on. Like, technically a membrane should work from an engineering standpoint, but it's not based on really a lot of good data, and it's also starting to already ignore some of the local perspectives. So in the 2000s, about 20 years later, this is what their water tower looked like. This is actually what it looked like in their system. And there's complaints from the community about the taste of chlorine. They don't like it in their water. They don't want it in their water. But by regulations, we have to disinfect. These are these are provincial regulations. They're national guidelines. We have to disinfect. And we're also seeing a rapid deterioration of infrastructure functionality. Membranes are breaking. They're not working correctly. They can't get replacement parts because, as you saw, they're a very remote community. They're not removing what they're supposed to remove because there's spikes in water quality that were not accounted for in the original design. And then at the same time, there was a restructuring in how the government agencies that oversee First Nations infrastructure can fund projects. And so communities were seeing a lot of these deterioration in infrastructure, not just this community, but other communities. And they weren't being able to pay for it, to pay for improvements. And that's a big issue, that there's not a financial base or a governance base in order to support infrastructure. So then by 2010, the membrane units are no longer working. They no longer can deal with what has now been identified as high manganese and iron in their source water. There's problems finding those modules and getting them to the locations. The plant, this is not an actual picture of the plant, but the plant kind of looked like this on the inside. It was just full of junk. Things weren't working correctly. Pipes don't go where they should. Nothing's labeled correctly. Things are going wrong, right, in terms of the situation. And then, unfortunately, by the time I got to Canada in 2015, this is made national news in Canada. This is what their water looked like. And this is manganese in the water. So manganese itself is what's called an aesthetic concern in the US. It doesn't right now have a regulatable health guideline, but that's being debated right now because it's a bad co-contaminant with iron and lead. And this is what their water looks like. It's staining people's laundry. Nobody wants to drink this. This is public outcry. The amount of backlash from this community was huge at this point. And what you can really see is kind of this legacy of bad decision making, of not thinking about a community, not thinking about things that are technical, or I'm sorry, not thinking about things that are non-technical in a system. And so by 2020, right, we have a water authority being formed, we have commissions being pulled together in order to make sure that we, address these concerns. And basically this history of very poor decision making that does not consider what's appropriate for the community has led to a long-term sustainability issue. You can't sustain this system, and people have been exposed to contaminated drinking water for years. And they are just now, I just talked to somebody who works for this First Nations Water Authority recently, they are just now getting a new water treatment plant in 2024 after this legacy of very poor decision making. So this is just one example of a First Nation in Canada. Unfortunately, there are many examples of this in Canada. The Navajo Nation in the United States has similar issues. Many reserves have the same issues. It's an equity concern as well as a social concern. So this is not limited to Canada or to this one specific case. This is widespread in terms of not considering what's going on in communities. So, the problem is that there's no community consultation, there's no co-design. We ignored sociocultural preferences. A breakdown of infrastructure happened much sooner because we weren't designing for a long life. We didn't have adequate training, we didn't have adequate maintenance, and we had a very remote location, and we had very poor water quality and exposure. And so there ended up being this huge loss of trust between community and the other involved parties, and it's still a mess today, unfortunately. It's getting better, people are not being exposed to things anymore, but the loss of trust has been huge in terms of a breakdown of institutions in this community. So, understanding how non-technical factors influence design choice is really critical. And the next couple slides the next couple examples are going to look at what's the problem, and then what are the things that you don't know if you don't talk to people. Talking to people and talking to communities is so critical. And then we're also going to look at what a solution must consider in order for that solution to be sustainable. So these are kind of how our next examples are going to be structured. So the next example comes from Costa Rica. I did not actually go down here for an engineering project. I went down for vacation, but my engineering brain does not turn off. And so I ended up with this example of the road to Matapalo in Costa Rica. So this is a very rural community that's known for a lot of ecotourism. It's a gorgeous place. This beach down here in the bottom is a location where they teach surf lessons. And basically what happens in this road is that there's just massive potholes. It's not paved. We have cars going off the side, and they just can't maintain this road. And you would think that over time there would be a way to potentially maintain this road. And so, there's part of the problem. But the other parts of the problem is that there's two seasons in Costa Rica, rainy and dry. During the rainy season, the road washes out, potholes are so big, motorcycles actually struggle to use the road. Heavy lorries, trucks often get stuck in the soft sand and the mud on the shoulder. We saw 2 of them getting towed out while I was there, and I was only there for a week. It's very dangerous to drive at night. There's no signs, there's no lights, no nothing. So this is just a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. But it goes to an area with a lot of ecotourism. So, what's going on here? This is the problem. And then we have things that, engineers would consider like technical thing, right? It's like, how do you get materials to the site? How do you get electricity if there's no power grid, right? But the non-technical thing is like, who has money to help, and why hasn't there been a long-term solution, right? These are things that we need to start thinking about. And what you don't know about this, unless you ask and start talking to people as you drive along this road, as I did, is that the government actually periodically repairs this road, and it repairs it around Christmas and Easter. And that's because that's when officials from Costa Rica go on vacation to this peninsula. So it looks great for 2 times a year with a little patchwork job, and then that's it. And then there's also kind of this weird influence of people from the States and from Western countries, expats, who actually don't necessarily want a well-maintained road. And you might think that doesn't make a lot of sense, but because they are part of a huge ecotourism business in this area, actually having a place that's hard to get to allows them to drive higher prices for their services, which is a more exclusive tourist experience, which is in direct contrast to locals who want a better road to just have access to services because they can't get resources, groceries, healthcare, any of this because most of the locals use motorbikes. They don't use cars. And so as a result, they're losing time and they're losing productive hours traveling back and forth. And so you don't know any of this, right? If you just look at the picture of the road and you need a technical engineering solution, you don't know any of this unless you actually talk to people. So I think that's one of the big first takeaways from this example is that you really do need to talk to people about what's going on in a given situation. So something that a sustainable solution is going to have to address in this community is thinking about power gaps and who has a say. And so I've put the sustainable development goals that I thought were relevant to this project on the bottom, but if you think there's more, that would be a great discussion topic for us. And we need a long-term solution for a reoccurring problem because seasonality is what's causing a lot of these washouts of the road. So we actually have to think a little bit more about the long term, I think. And then balancing access to this biological diverse area with the income that tourism would bring. So that's something to think about with this example. And if any of these specific examples really strike your fancy and you want to discuss them in class, that would be a great point to bring up. The next one I'm going to talk about is Nicaragua. And when I was in my undergrad, I traveled with Colorado School of Mines Engineers Without Borders to Nicaragua. And I am somewhere on that bridge. I don't remember where, but I helped to build that bridge project. And then what we have down in the right-hand corner is a well project in this area. So the question that I'm going to ask in this particular instance is, do you think that the community needs a bridge or drinking water first? And you probably know where my bias is, being a drinking water person. But what's going to influence our decision to choose one project over the other? And what should we do as our first project? Because this was the first project that we ever did for Mines Engineers Without Borders. Do we do a bridge or do we do a well? It's kind of an interesting question. So a bridge, the benefits would be that people can now get access to healthcare and services, right? It's easier to get to nearby towns. It saves time. This is another example of a country that has things wash out because of rainy seasons. And then a well would have the benefits of having clean water directly in the community. It decreases the burden of traveling to collect water. It promotes self-sufficiency, both do. And it decreases the burden of waterborne disease. So being the water person that I am, I think, well, let's do a well, because if we decrease the burden of waterborne disease, people aren't going to have to go to get health care somewhere else. But again, this is a situation that is not that simple. What you don't know unless you ask is that there's political games going on. So even though with Engineers Without Borders it should be a community-driven project, money from the quote-unquote community is coming from municipal governments. And it looks better to build a bridge than a well because of the visibility of infrastructure. You can see a bridge. Wells are not sexy, right? Bridges make great pictures. So that's actually a big factor here. The other thing is that as engineers, we actually have to get access to resources to do these types of projects. And we had connections to Bridges to Prosperity, which made it easier to start with a bridge first and get materials to a community. And that is actually a factor. Like, we shouldn't ignore these technical kind of things that are important, right? It's not to say that we should ignore them, right? And then, we did have internal priorities as an Engineers Without Borders chapter. We needed to get the club established and on the map, because unless you're established, you can't continue to do projects with communities. So there would be no way for us to do a well. And so it was actually easier for us to do a bridge, and the community did want the bridge. It's not that they didn't want the bridge, but it's that you have to think about all of these extra things going on. Like, maybe it sounds great to do a well, but what else is going on that you need to think about? So I always bring up this one because this was my first big experience with making these types of decisions, and it really did influence a lot of where I went in my career afterwards. So a sustainable solution is going to have to address access to services, whether or not it's a bridge or a well. It has to think about a long-term plan to also address the other one. We need a long-term ability to work with the community. And so we have to actually think about what the community wants. And if the community says they want the bridge first, we need to honor the fact that they want the bridge first, because that's going to establish a connection to the community. So maybe we think as engineers the well makes more sense first, but we also have to acknowledge what a community wants. We can absolutely have conversations back and forth, but you have to think about your client in these situations. And then thinking about how the community is going to fund is important too. All right, so this is actually not an example of my own, but it's an example from a movie in Afghanistan. So I don't know if any of you have watched Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, but it's a fictional account based on a real story of a woman who was a journalist in Afghanistan. And there's this really nice anecdote in the movie that I like to bring up, where there's this well in a very remote area, and somebody keeps blowing it up. This is during the Afghan war. In a very specific village, somebody keeps blowing it up. They put in this new well, and soldiers have to keep coming back to repair this well. And they can't figure out who keeps doing it. They think it's, bands of terrorists, they think it's rebels, and they can't come up with a long-term solution as to why don't you want a new well in your town? It makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? Well, what do you don't know unless you ask? Well, getting well from the original water well was the only time that women actually had access to themselves to socialize each week. So I don't know how much you know about the strictness of religion and culture in Afghanistan, but this is a place where women still wear burqas, where they are not allowed to interact with each other. And being able to go out to the original well, and even though it was a long way away in a walk, it was the only time that they had to socialize with each other. And when that well was located closer to the village, the women now never have time to leave their homes unless the husbands allow it. And so it's actually the women who keep blowing up this well because they have lost something that's very important to them in their own social interactions. And I think that that's a very powerful example of understanding what types of inequalities exist in cultures and trying not to exacerbate inequalities that already exist. So a sustainable solution here needs to think about the balance between providing clean water, because that is important, but also considering social dynamics in a community, right? Where you locate a solution and who has access to that solution absolutely matters. And we don't want to exacerbate any existing social inequalities. That's huge, because these goals down on the bottom here of gender equality, reduced inequality, access to clean water and sanitation, these are big things for us to address going forward. And I think this example is just so illustrative of, something that you would never, ever think about. And you really need to understand the context in which you're designing, and it's just so critical. So I really like this example from the movie. The movie's kind of goofy, and it's a fun to watch, but I have always loved this example because it's just so clear how we really need to think about what people actually want in a scenario. The last example is another one of my own examples, and it comes from the Canadian Arctic. I did some work with infrastructure up there for a little while. And infrastructure in the Arctic is 100% different from what we call the global south. And infrastructure in the Arctic can't be buried. You can't bury pipes because they freeze, and as you have freeze-thaw with the permafrost, pipes shift. You can't have the same kind of foundations you have. You don't have the same electrical grid. You don't have the same Wi-Fi. And what you're actually seeing on the very top two pictures are how water gets transported in these communities. So there are no pipes. Water gets transported either by hand or by truck. And every single home actually has its own water tank where they store water. And so you can actually see an example. This is a community called Pond Inlet, which is up in the Arctic Circle in Canada. And this is actually what the community looks like. It is extremely remote and has a lot of interesting features. So constructing and maintaining that infrastructure is very difficult in the Arctic. There's no water or wastewater infrastructure. We can't bury it. We can't get large machinery or snowplows up here. It's very difficult. Electricity and Wi-Fi access is very intermittent. The other one that I like to bring up here is getting materials is also very difficult to this community. So that's important, right? There's a problem of trying to get people access to infrastructure that we have and we take for granted in the rest of Canada and the rest of the US. But here's the things that you don't know unless you start to study this problem in more detail. So the reason materials are very sparse is because materials only come up to the community once a year. They come up via barge or by a plane. There are no access roads to this community. If you look at a map of Canada, there are no roads. The only access to this community is by air or sea. Barges come up probably twice a year, maybe once, twice on a good day. So if you need replacement parts, you have to order them 6 months in advance. That is extreme supply chain challenges, right? The other thing is climate change is altering the permafrost layer substantially. So existing infrastructure is collapsing. That's been buried in the past in these types of communities because as that permafrost freezes and thaws, it causes cracks and shifts in underground infrastructure. This is also an area where we have a lot of native communities. These are Inuit communities in the Arctic, and so there's a lot of traditional beliefs about the sanctity of water. And so people actually will go out and they'll source water from glaciers because traditionally that's considered a much safer source of water. It's purer, it comes from the earth, and so people will go and get that water even though it's never been disinfected or treated in the way that we would think it should be. And then political and funding structures are a massive complex web. So that's what you're seeing on the left side of the screen. That is all of the people who have some sort of say in putting in water or wastewater infrastructure in the Arctic. That is massive. That's a lot of people that you have to talk to in order to get a project off the ground. And I experienced that firsthand, how difficult it is to try and help a community that comes to you as an engineer with a problem, but then you have to make sure that that problem meets regulations and meets codes and doesn't infringe upon the hamlet's rights or the territory's rights. It's very challenging. So that's important as you go forward. So a solution has to think about materials that are going to stay in good working order, like sourcing the right materials so that maintenance is very low is super, super critical to the sustainability and longevity of the system. And then also thinking about those traditional values, you know, could we think a little bit more about where we're getting water so that we think about people's traditional beliefs? And then we need to think about how do we locate funds and support. We need a lot of institutional support for these types of solutions. So that's all I'm going to say on these types of examples. I hope this has gotten you thinking about all of these challenges that we really face in terms of bringing real world solutions to people and what is actually considered appropriate for people. Think about kind of positionality. Where are you situated? What beliefs have you been brought up with that might influence how you think about engineering design? And then if any of these specific examples really caught your interest, bring some more questions, or if you have some of your own examples that you can think of, those would be great things to bring as well. Thanks for listening in on this one. This is one of my favorite lectures, and I'm looking forward to discussing more with you in class.